This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome our distinguished guests and visitors here to the first of two Research and Science Education Subcommittee hearings dedicated to the development of legislation to reauthorize programs at the National Science Foundation. Today we'll hear from the Distinguished Director of the National Science Foundation and the Chair of the National Science Board. Next week we will hear from a diverse panel of outside witnesses who will weigh in on some of the broader issues we hope to address through this legislation, including support for young investigators, NSF's important role in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM education, the industry's role in supporting basic research, and the future of interdisciplinary research. As part of our hearing today, I hope we'll look at the issue of young investigators. In fiscal year 2006, new investigators achieved an 18% funding success rate compared to a returning investigator success rate of 30% and an overall agency rate of 25%. I know that NSF is making it a priority to narrow this gap and that it supports outstanding young investigators through the very prestigious Career Grants program. However, I also believe that more can be done to nurture and support new researchers and that we need to be creative in figuring out ways to keep bright young researchers in the pipeline. For this reason, the committee is considering creating a new pilot program of seed grants to new investigators to give them an opportunity to strengthen their proposals before resubmitting them through the merit review process. Another topic of particular interest to us today is industry's role in funding basic research. There are leaders in high-tech industry that understand that their future depends in large part on the scientific advances made by researchers in university labs across the country. Unfortunately, however, many in industry fail to see or ignore the potential for university-industry partnerships to further their own success and competitiveness. NSF can play a significant role in changing attitudes and fostering partnerships by providing incentives to both university researchers and private sector officials to bridge this divide and encourage participation in research. This committee is also quite concerned about the slow growth and, in some cases, shrinking budget of STEM education programs at NSF. Chairman Gordon has introduced legislation to strengthen and broaden existing K-12 STEM education programs at NSF, in particular Noyce Teacher Scholarship Program, the Math and Science Partnership, and the STEM Talent Expansion Program. Today I'd like to spend time discussing NSF's role in STEM education, including technological training at two-year colleges through the Advanced Technological Education Program. And I might interject also that I'm very grateful for Dr. Cora Merritt at visiting my district last week and meeting with a number of educational leaders throughout the spectrum. Dr. Merritt, it was a pleasure to have you out there, and I'm glad you managed to get home in spite of the travel difficulties. Today I also hope that we will explore the concept of interdisciplinary research. The frontiers of 21st century science are very much dominated by what most would consider to be interdisciplinary research conducted by teams of scientists that integrate information, data, methods, perspectives, and theories from two or more bodies of specialized knowledge to advance fundamental understanding or solve problems beyond the scope of a single discipline. Without compromising the strength of the individual discipline or the ability of the lone scientist to make great advances on narrow topics within his or her own field, we need to also make sure that interdisciplinary proposals get a fair hearing. NSF has shown a great leadership on this issue, but I believe there are ways to better define this process and look forward to ongoing discussions with the agency and the community on ways to go about this. I should add that many of these issues that we must deal with in the context of NSF reauthorization are issues that the greater community is also grappling with. However, because NSF funds 20% of basic research at U.S. colleges and universities across all science and engineering disciplines, and because NSF continues to be at the forefront of the ever-evolving scientific enterprise, they are issues of particular importance to me, to this subcommittee, and to the NSF. In addition to some of these broad issues, we'll take a look today at some specific budget and administrative issues at the Foundation, some of which are long-standing issues of concern, and others of which have been brought to the attention of the committee more recently. I want to note this committee supports the administration's proposal to double funding for basic science research over a 10-year period, and the authorization levels that we will propose are aligned with the administration's plans. However, I also want to suggest that we can't afford to keep playing this game of increasing funding for one set of disciplines while decreasing or flatlining funding of others. We will continue to advocate for increased fundings for basic and applied research across the board, but we need help from the entire scientific community in justifying such increases to the rest of our colleagues in Congress and to the American taxpayer as well. We must also recognize these are tight budget times. We can't simply throw money at science because we want to. We need to maintain diligence in ensuring that research we fund is of top quality, that federally funded researchers are held to the highest standards of ethical conduct of research, and that we are thoughtful in setting priorities for research funding. Finally, I want to be clear that the process for developing NSF reauthorization bill is to be open, transparent, and responsive to all concerned parties, both within and outside the government. I welcome your suggestions and encourage you to be in touch with me with your thoughts or ideas, and that's the broad you, not just our witnesses today, but others if they're here in the audience or in the scientific community. We welcome their feedback and their suggestions. Dr. Bement, Dr. Beering, thank you for being here with us today. I look forward to hearing your testimony, to receiving your input and guidance as we develop this NSF reauthorization legislation, and thank you both for your leadership on the Foundation and the Board. And I now yield to my colleague, Ranking Member Ehlers, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here, representing one of the finest institutions in the federal government, and perhaps the finest. You will find this to be a friendly committee, I'm sure. Certainly more friendly than much of the rest of the Congress. Not that anyone dislikes you, but they all say they like you but don't provide money for you. We will continue to try to do what we can, not only like you, but provide money for you. I am pleased to participate in the Research and Science Education Subcommittee's first hearing of this Congress to address the reauthorization of the National Science Foundation. The goals of reauthorization are to improve the functioning of an agency known for both high-caliber research output and internal efficiency, which makes our job somewhat more challenging than trying to improve upon an agency with glaring shortcomings. Finding areas in need of improvement can be best achieved from hearing from expert witnesses like those before us today, and the NSF consumers who will testify at the end of the month in their second hearing. In finding areas for strengthening and improvement, I believe we must remain cognizant of the uniqueness of the National Science Foundation. What goes for other agencies may not necessarily apply to NSF. I know the committee is interested in exploring some of the relationships the National Science Foundation has established with industry, and I am keenly interested in encouraging these relationships while maintaining the quality of NSF fundamental research. As current researchers know, potential applications are important, but should not dictate research design exclusively. Chairman Baird and I share concerns in several areas of NSF, including maintaining the integrity and capacity of the peer review process, managing increasingly interdisciplinary research portfolios, and educating our future workforce in all STEM-related jobs, not just those historically identified as science and engineering careers. Finally, I look forward to hearing about NSF's preparations for future funding increases that this committee has worked tirelessly to authorize and ultimately see supported through the appropriations process. And I certainly also share the chairman's concern about the young scientists and certainly encouraging them so that they can get their feet in the door, begin their tenure track before they lose their position for lack of funding of their research. I thank Dr. Bement and Dr. Beering for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony.
If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record. At this time, I'd like to introduce our two witnesses. Dr. Arden Bement is director of the National Science Foundation. He became the director in 2004 after having served more than 2 years as director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Dr. Stephen Beering is the chair of the National Science Board. He has served on the board since 2002, was elected chairman in 2006. Before retiring in 2000, he served for 17 years as president of Purdue University in Indiana. As our witnesses both know well, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions, and we will start with Dr. Bement again. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. You've raised a number of important issues in your invitation letter, and I commend you both for taking an active role in promoting a discussion of these questions. Before I address some of your specific questions, I want to let you know how much I appreciate your strong statements of support for our fiscal year 2008 budget request. As you know, the request will provide an 8.7% increase over the continuing resolution. Funding at this level will keep NSF on the course set by the President's American Competitiveness Initiative to drive innovation and sharpen America's competitive edge. Let me move on to the specific issues you've raised. The first is in regard to NSF's efforts to nurture young investigators. We take this responsibility very seriously and address it in a variety of ways. Our signature faculty early career development program, called Career, is our most prestigious award in support of the early career development of young investigators. Successful applicants must effectively integrate research and education within the context of their organization's mission. NSF provides 400 new career awards annually, each for a duration of 5 years, to some of the best and brightest young researchers in the country. Each year, NSF nominates the most meritorious new career awardees for the Presidential Early Career Awards for Scientists and Engineers, called PCASE. This presidential award is the nation's highest honor bestowed on scientists and engineers beginning their careers. NSF also engages in a variety of outreach efforts to support and nurture young investigators. Our NSF Days program provides workshops to assist investigators in understanding the process of submitting proposals to NSF. Over the past 5 years, we have sponsored 40 workshops that have attracted nearly 6,000 participants. Additional outreach efforts pair NSF program officers with researchers whose proposals have been declined in an effort to improve proposals for subsequent resubmission. The effectiveness of these efforts is shown by the fact that the share of grants to new investigators has remained stable at about 28% over the past decade, although the overall success rate has declined from around 30% to 21%. In that same period, the proportion of grantees receiving an award within 7 years of their last degree has also remained stable at about 74%. Let me quickly move on to the matter of an appropriate balance between interdisciplinary and disciplinary research. Support for interdisciplinary research is a priority for the NSF because it presents a tremendous opportunity for innovation. Finding the proper balance results from discussions with the National Science Board and through feedback from our many stakeholders. NSF centers and the priority areas outlined in our budget also serve as catalysts for generating interdisciplinary proposals. We continually make a strong effort to communicate our interest in supporting interdisciplinary research. The flexibility of NSF's merit review process allows program officers to use multiple approaches to meet the challenge of reviewing interdisciplinary proposals. In some cases, male reviews are used to provide deep expertise on various aspects of proposals. Panel reviews are often used to integrate reviews from different disciplinary perspectives and to provide a broader interdisciplinary overview. Recognizing interdisciplinary proposals poses little difficulty, especially when they are submitted in response to a specific solicitation. FastLane, our electronic grant application process, also gives PIs an opportunity to select multiple programs to consider their proposal. In fiscal year 2004, the National Science Board initiated a task force on transformative research, and a planning document generated by this task force is currently under review. A key concern of this effort is stimulating interdisciplinarity, that is, transformative research while maintaining the balance with disciplinary research. Ultimately, this issue can only be addressed through continuous feedback between NSF and the scientific community. Maintaining this balance is central to our role as stewards of the U.S. scientific and engineering enterprise. Let me move on to the matter of how NSF focuses attention to research issues of national importance. To meet the research challenges that rise to national significance, NSF relies on input from many sources: reports from the national academies, R&D guidance as presented by the OSTP-OMB Priorities Memo and the National Science Board, presidential priorities such as the American Competitiveness Initiative, congressional interest, and our extensive interaction with the research community. NSF research priorities are evaluated on a continuous basis by our advisory committees, committees of visitors, and scientific conferences, strategic plans, and so forth. By funding collaborative grants and cooperative agreements, NSF can foster partnerships with academia and industry, potentially expediting the transition of basic research to products. NSF Center programs engage directly in encouraging industry and university partnerships. But perhaps NSF's most effective partnership with industry is our support of undergraduate and graduate students who enter the private sector armed with the latest understanding of advances in science and engineering fields. Mr. Chairman, the issues you have raised in this hearing are of profound importance, not only to NSF, but to the nation. They are not easy matters, nor do they lend themselves to simplistic or formulaic solutions. But I look forward to working with you on these issues and would be pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Bement, and I'm painfully aware that for something as complicated as NSF and the related board, 5 minutes introductory statement is not nearly enough, but please rest assured we'll give you plenty of time through the Q&A to elaborate on some of the very, very salient points you made.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Beering.
I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you. I'm the President Emeritus of Purdue University, and I'm privileged to be here with Arden Bement, with whom I've worked for the past 15 years, both at Purdue and at the National Science Foundation. This is my first time to testify before you as Chairman of the National Science Board, a position to which I was elected in May '06, and I'm indeed honored to be with you. Congress established the National Science Board in 1950 and gave it dual responsibilities: to guide the activities of and establish the policies for the National Science Foundation, and to serve as an independent advisory body to the President and the Congress on national policy issues related to science and engineering research and education. On behalf of the entire board and the widespread and diverse research and education communities that we all serve, I thank the members of this subcommittee for your long-term support of a broad portfolio of investments in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics research and education. Your continuing bipartisan commitment to excellence in U.S. science and engineering research and education has ensured that the U.S. remains a leader in global innovation and discovery. My complete written testimony has already been submitted to you for the record. Let me now briefly address the questions Chairman Baird raised in his letter of March 7. First, what can NSF do to nurture young investigators and to improve their funding rates? This is a major and ongoing concern for the board. In our December '03 report to Congress that responded to Section 22 of the last NSF Authorization Act, we identified the need of an additional $1 billion over the 5-year period of '02 to '07 to fund more grants generally, and $200 million to fund an expansion of the institutions of higher education participating in NSF activities, including funding for startup awards to new PhDs at those institutions. New PhDs just starting their academic careers, no matter how excellent the academic record, are less likely to be employed by top-tier institutions and more likely to start their careers in primarily teaching situations. Expanding research in these institutions therefore opens doors for new PhDs to build careers in research. We also support the expansion of the NSF Career, Faculty Early Career, and similar programs, coupled with general expansion of funding for basic research, also called for by the American Competitiveness Initiative and the National Academy's report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. The NSF authorization of '02 included a welcome authority to double the budget over a 5-year period to nearly $10 billion in '07. The actual '07 budget of approximately $6 billion represents a significant gap with the '02 authorization. The American Competitiveness Initiative again calls for a doubling of the NSF budget over a 10-year period. We would respectfully suggest that the time to implement these admirable authorizations and initiatives has never been more urgent than now. Your second series of questions regarding NSF funding for interdisciplinary research focused on the appropriate balance between funding for interdisciplinary and disciplinary research, best mechanisms for soliciting and funding interdisciplinary research proposals, and the sufficiency of publicizing interdisciplinary research funding opportunities at NSF. This is another area to which NSF and the board have given considerable attention and resources. Nonetheless, there remain substantial issues to assure that interdisciplinary research is not disadvantaged in the highly competitive NSF merit review system or in the academic sector by structural impediments. NSF has taken a number of steps over a long period of time to ensure that the level of investment and mechanisms of support address structural roadblocks to funding interdisciplinary research. For example, NSF supports nearly 100 centers in part to provide greater opportunities for and encourage interdisciplinary research. The most recent board guidance to NSF on balance between centers and individual investigator awards establishes a 6 to 8% of the R&RA budget as an appropriate level to support centers. With respect to publicizing opportunities for interdisciplinary research, I should point out that most research proposals submitted to NSF are unsolicited, and that is a good thing for the health of U.S. research. To a great extent, this enables the research community to self-identify and establish a balance between disciplinary and interdisciplinary work on the basis of opportunities for discovery and the quality of the research proposals submitted. However, it is also important to ensure that researchers are knowledgeable about all NSF funding opportunities and the process for obtaining that funding, and further that the review process is fair and results in the best use of scarce funding to fund cutting-edge research. You also ask about the NSF role in research driven by national needs and fostering university-industry partnerships and the application of Criterion 2, which encourages partnerships, of the NSF merit review process with regard to national needs. NSF's mission is defined in the NSF Act in terms of national needs, and such needs, both broadly and narrowly defined, have always shaped the portfolio of our investments. The board established Criterion 2 of the merit review system in part to enhance partnerships, potential benefits to society, and contributions to innovation. Further, NSF has long participated in interagency R&D priorities, most recently including the National Nanotechnology Initiative, Climate Change Science Program, Networking and Information Technology R&D, and Homeland Security. Moreover, NSF Center programs often explicitly require partnering with industry. In addition, NSF funds small business innovation research and cross-agency and cross-sectoral research programs in such areas as earthquake science and engineering and research in the polar regions. The board has also recently published a report recommending a new national hurricane research initiative that cuts across fields of science, suggests a co-lead role for NSF and NOAA, and includes a number of additional agencies as major players. Your final question concerns NSF's priorities in K-16 science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so-called STEM education, and how the current budget reflects those priorities, especially NSF's role in undergraduate education. The board has been especially concerned with this major area of NSF's responsibility: education in science, technology, engineering, and math. Education is a core mission of NSF. Even while U.S. student performance in mathematics and science is declining relatively as assessed internationally, changing workforce requirements mean that new workers will need ever more sophisticated skills in STEM disciplines. Following a request from Congress, the board established a new advisory commission on 21st century education in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in March of '06, comprising a wide range of eminent experts representing the broad scope of interests in U.S. STEM education. We have charged that commission to examine and advise us on the role of NSF in both pre-college and undergraduate education as part of its activities. Moreover, the board is expecting shortly to receive the report of our Education and Human Resources Committee on engineering education reform, primarily at the undergraduate level. We expect that following our board meeting next week, when we will receive advice from our STEM Education Commission, and over the next few months with the work of the board's Education and Human Resources Committee evaluating assessments of NSF education programs, we will develop new guidance to the Foundation on its priorities for education programs at the undergraduate and pre-college levels. Following our board meeting next week, we would welcome the opportunity to meet with individual members of your committee and others in the Congress and the administration to discuss the board's National Action Plan for addressing our nation's STEM education needs. The federal investment in the nation's science and technology is a necessity for our future prosperity and security. To quote a recent editorial by Microsoft founder Bill Gates in the Washington Post, "If the United States is to remain a global economic leader, we must foster an environment that enables a new generation to dream up innovations. As other nations ramp up their investment in the infrastructure for research and innovation, we cannot be complacent." I've just returned this past week from the European Union's Congress, and I am absolutely impressed and astounded at the progress of those 27 nations. We must sustain the advantages that we have gained through continued wise, adequate federal support for our science and engineering research and education enterprise. The National Science Foundation is a key asset to our nation, having proven itself effective in stimulating discovery and innovation for now over half a century, working in partnership with the research and higher education communities. The board is committed to working with you to assure that limited federal funding resources are optimally invested through the National Science Foundation to sustain U.S. leadership in science and technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Beering. I will take you up on the offer to get together to discuss the STEM education study you've come up with. And Dr. Ehlers and I and other members of the committee who are interested, I'm sure we'll find a time to do that, as it's of critical importance. I also see present in our audience a number of the ADs for the various science directorates we met with last week. Good to see all of you folks. Thanks for being here and for your work, and also staff from the Science Board as well. We appreciate the work of the staff. At this point, we'll open up our first round of questions. The chair would recognize himself for 5 minutes. And related to the issue of staff that I just raised, one of my first questions would be, as we talk about the idea of possibly doubling the budget, which I hope we'll do over the next several years, that will carry with it some administrative needs, including workforce, infrastructure, and travel. If we just expand the number of research grants, but we don't expand the infrastructure necessary to manage those grants, it seems to me we'll be in some trouble. I'd open it up to either of you to address that issue and any thoughts you have about how it needs to be addressed.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for calling attention to an item that is absolutely critical to the quality of our work. Many of the opportunities that the Foundation faces right now that has to do with mentoring young investigators, that has to do with our post-award and pre-award oversight activities, as well as maintaining quality of our merit review process, is dependent entirely on our program officers and program directors. At the present time, they're chronically overworked. I worry that they may not be picking up the transformative research opportunities for a lack of time to really dig into some of the good proposals that they're getting. That has to be rectified, but in addition to that, we need to maintain our investments in productivity-enhancing tools, both electronic and otherwise, that take some of the workload off our staff. Travel is important because you can't do post-award oversight unless you can get out and visit the investigators, either at meetings where they congregate or at their home research laboratories. All these taken together, plus issues of cybersecurity, modernizing our information technology within the Foundation, fall under our agency operations and award management budget line. And I would urge in reauthorization, that be included as a major priority. And I would also very much welcome your advocacy to be sure that we get full funding this year in our 08 request.
I appreciate that. I think, oftentimes when the appropriation season comes around and we look for offsets, we tend to say, well, we'll go after the administrative line. But the administrative personnel are necessary to make the system work, and not only just the personnel, but as you say, the travel, the equipment, the resources. And it's just not responsible or realistic to say we're going to plus up one side and not give the resources to sustain that. So we will make that a priority.
Thank you.
Secondly, I'm intrigued by the process, and it's a discussion that would probably extend well beyond today, but the process by which the board and the foundation determine where the resources will go and what percentage of the dollars and what total amount of dollars will go to one directorate versus another, or one enterprise within a directorate versus another. Let me throw out a thought that occurred to me the other day. Quite understandably, I think, when you look at, say, the big super colliders and giant telescopes, a tremendous amount of money is going to those, and they're expensive installations. But as I look at some of the greatest national challenges we're going to face in the next several decades, I would say one would be the war on terror and the national security issue. A second would be clearly energy. A third would be rising health care costs, etc. As I look at those, a portion of those will be addressed by the traditional physical, biological, and other sciences. But behavior, human behavior, is going to have a great deal to do. In fact, if we wanted to truly address our energy crisis in the most immediate way possible, it would not be through cellulosic ethanol or, for God's sakes, nuclear fusion, which is a little ways off, to say the least. It would be by everybody driving less and carpooling and using mass transit, and if we did that, we could cut energy consumption by 10%. I raised that to ask, do we need some grand challenges in the social sciences, or grand social challenges to which we would apply the social sciences in addition to the other sciences, and how might that be considered by the foundation or the board in the coming years?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. There's no question, but the human component in all our research is increasing because of the increasing complexity of the research. You mentioned interdisciplinarity. In many of our interdisciplinary programs, the social scientists are a full partner. Grand challenges are important because the cost of doing research in the social sciences is going up because of increasing complexity and size of databases, and the kind of research that they need to do in trying to analyze those type of data with advanced cyber infrastructure. So I fully agree that we do have to give appropriate emphasis to the social sciences. We have to integrate them with all our other major programs, and the grand challenge idea is a good one.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Dr. Beering, you made some comments about what you'd like to see in the reauthorization language. Dr. Bement, I'm wondering if there is anything specific you would like to request as we reauthorize, other than saying you want all the money and no control. But
well, obviously, flexibility is important, and lack of prescriptive language, that would be very helpful. I think the most important need I've already discussed as far as our agency operation and award management account. I think that deserves special notice in the reauthorization bill. A very minor element, we do have the Waterman Award, which honors the first director of the foundation. And each year we try to select one from many disciplines and many outstanding candidates. I continually get a request from the excellent committee we have that goes through the screening process and has a very difficult time, that this may be the time to increase it to 3. So I would put that before the committee as a component of the bill.
Let me ask both of you, you've seen draft language of what's being proposed. Are there any parts that you particularly like, and more importantly, any parts you don't like?
The answer is yes.
Thank you. Could you be a little more specific?
Well, I've got a large number of notes that I would like to present for the record, but clearly, under the major research instrumentation section, which is Section 3, Part D, we have just increased the ceiling to $4 million, and we've also increased the funding in the 08 request to $114 million. We don't know yet what the skew will be of that distribution and who we may be disadvantaging in the lower cost instrumentation across our constituency, and especially in some of the minority serving institutions and EPSCoR institutions. My recommendation there is to increase the ceiling stepwise as we increase the budget, rather than to raise the ceiling so high that one or two awards would greatly disadvantage a larger number of applicants for important equipment. I think the thing that Section 5 is a good section. As far as interdisciplinary research, we've already addressed that. There's always more that we can do, but invariably it deals with the nature of the science question that needs to be addressed and how the community responds to that. So as a bottom-up organization, we really can't define all the opportunities for interdisciplinarity, but we certainly encourage it. We've been at this now for 25 years, and finally the universities are getting religion, and they've begun to reduce the silos a little bit. So in our unsolicited proposals, we're seeing an increasing fraction, and now it's up to anywhere from 40 to perhaps 50%. There are multiple PI, and many of those are interdisciplinary, but they're unsolicited. And I could go on. There's much more in here.
Well, we'd certainly appreciate having that for the record. Dr. Beering, any comments you wish to make?
Yeah, we addressed that issue and others in my written testimony, starting on page 14, and we also addressed it in a previous hearing on March the 20th. Let me comment specifically on your Section 6 on new investigators. We are struggling with how we can get transformative research front and center in our endeavors, and I think this new section here is going to be helpful in that regard. And then Section 11 on STEM education is very vital. I expect that our STEM education report is going to recommend some specific action plans, one of which is to increase the length of the school year. As you compare ourselves with Asia and Europe, it's astounding how much more time their students spent in class and formal instruction than ours do, and some of the requirements they have for science and language, which we do not have. So I would highlight those two items as extremely helpful.
Dr. Bement?
Let me bring up one other section that I think is critically important, and that's Section 12 on cost sharing. Let me first emphasize that we accept cost sharing. In fact, we encourage it. We just don't require it. And the reason we don't require it is that there are many institutions and many investigators that can't get a cost share, especially, again, among minority-serving institutions and some EPSCoR states, for example. To put it in as a requirement disadvantages them from even being able to submit a proposal. And I think that's wrong. I think we should continue to encourage cost share, but we should not mandate it.
Thank you both. I see my time has expired.
Dr. Bradley.
Thank you very much. Appreciate very much you being here. I have two issues I'd like to pursue. One is the huge problem that we face in this country in two dialogues, major dialogues that we're having in agreement on the facts. It's very difficult to have an intelligent conversation if you can't agree on the facts. Of course, we're all privileged to have our own interpretations, but we shouldn't have our own facts. The two areas I'm thinking of, one of them is climate change and global warming. And to whom should we turn? Your organizations are certainly among those. To whom should we turn as an honest broker so that we can have some agreed upon facts for this discussion?
Well, Dr. Bartlett, it's good that you brought up that question, because I just came from Dartmouth University, where we had all the Arctic nations come together and discuss that for about 3 days. The evidence is clear. There is climate change, there is global warming, there are anthropogenic effects. We need to understand the extent of those types of effects. The trends are not looking good. In fact, they may not be linear. In fact, I suspect they're not linear. They can become autocatalytic over time. So you just can't take what's happened in the past and project it very, very comfortably into the future. I think it's a global problem that will require global approaches to research and global approaches to mitigation.
To whom do we turn for some agreement on what the facts are so that we can have an intelligent conversation? Another area that's very important is the energy area and peak oil. And if, in fact, we have reached, as many people believe we have, the maximum capability of the Earth for producing oil from conventional sources, then we in the United States, particularly in the world in general, faces a very uncertain future.
Well, I would recommend you turn to the National Science Foundation. First of all, we don't fetter any of our staff or any of our grantees in taking an open stance on any issue. In fact, we have requirements in our grant manual that requires open sharing and open publication and an open discussion of issues. So that goes on all the time, and certainly we would welcome any questions you have on any of those issues. And certainly working with the National Science Board, that's an ideal place to raise some of those issues.
As an example of one of the areas, and you mentioned the cellulosic ethanol, there's now a lot of hype about the cellulosic ethanol. A speech was given by Hyman Rickover 50 years ago, the 15th day of this May, to a group of physicians at St. Paul, Minnesota. And in that he noted that the time would come when we would have to change from fossil fuels to renewables, and that there would then be a tension between food and energy. And we've seen that tension in corn ethanol. We produce relatively trifling amounts of ethanol from corn, but we've doubled the price of corn, and tortillas have gone up so that poor Mexicans can hardly afford to buy them. And our dairy industry is dying now because of the increased price of corn. So now we're turning to cellulosic ethanol. But Hyman Rickover also noted that there was going to be a tension between energy and soil fertility. What is the potential for cellulosic ethanol? To whom should we return for a rational analysis of this? Because now there's a lot of what I think it is unrational exuberance over this.
First of all, I worked with Admiral Rickover in the Pentagon some years back, and I had an opportunity to see how his mind works, so it doesn't surprise me a bit that he was 20 years or 30 years ahead of his time. Cellulosic ethanol is an opportunity for the future. There's a lot of research going on at the present time to determine how to break cellulose as well as lignin, for that matter, and to do it economically through better enzymes and through better bacteria strains to convert cellulose to starch to alcohol. I think the hidden challenge is water. This nation is going to be challenged for water supply, and you can't produce ethanol without water. And so the idea that you can go into the grasslands and suddenly set up huge factories to produce cellulosic ethanol or even corn-derived fermented alcohol, I think is a little bit too optimistic unless you can figure out how to pipe water to the production facilities. So my feeling is that Michigan is probably in a very good position as compared with, say, South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. McNerney, Inspector General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ehlers. I want to commend the board. I'm a new member of Congress, and I spent my career in the research and development area, and I've always been impressed with the National Science Foundation, the sorts of projects that are funded, how efficiently they work, and so on. So I think it's a very good operation. I'm proud to be on the committee overseeing that operation. Now, I have a couple of questions. My first question is a structural issue. What specifically is being done to award, in the merit review process, to award new researchers as opposed to researchers with a track record of publications? And in that process, how can we make sure that we're being fair to the more seasoned researchers?
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we take a look at what I would call market share, which is a surrogate for competition, competitiveness. And when we see that new researchers are garnering about 28% of the awards, that's good in itself, but it's been stable over a time when the success rate has gone down, which means that we're now in a more competitive time than we were maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But at the same time, we've been able to sustain that market share for younger investigators. The one thing that I've tried to do is to put more emphasis on unsolicited grants, because it's usually unsolicited grants where young investigators get their start. They build their research teams. They have a bright idea, perhaps an extension of their dissertation, but perhaps not. And I can report that when I came into the foundation, the percentage of research grants that were unsolicited was 71%, which means that 29% were solicited. Today, the unsolicited grants are up to 80%, and the solicited grants are at 20%, which indicates we're skewing the opportunity for these types of grant proposals from young investigators. The other thing that every young investigator has to go through a learning curve. When they first come to a university, they've got to set up a research group. They've got to equip a laboratory. Then they've got to figure out what the first graduate student is going to work on. And then usually the first 2 or 3 proposals don't make it. So they need feedback, and they need encouragement, and they need mentoring and getting up that learning curve. And our program officers are absolutely masters at providing that type of guidance and that type of feedback. But again, I go back to my earlier point. They are very much overworked, and the more opportunity we give them, the better they can do that job.
Okay, I have an unrelated question. I am struggling through the report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, it's a disturbing report, and I agree with the conclusions. Now, our subcommittee was informed that only 2 of the 8 division directors and deputy division directors in the NSF Education Directorate are filled by temporary employees, and the other 6 positions are vacant. Now, I'm glad to see Dr. Merritt in the audience, but has that situation changed, or is there something that we need to take steps on in that regard?
Well, the reason the situation has changed is because Dr. Merritt is on board, and she's looking to fill in those positions and to develop her own team. But let me ask if she wants to add. Those positions will be filled very shortly.
Okay. All right, thank you. I yield back.
We've been joined by the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Hall from Texas.
I'll yield my time at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Dr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, Ranking Member Ehlers had mentioned his great esteem that he holds for NSF, and I certainly will concur with that. And good to see Dr. Bement and Dr. Buring both be here today. And I'll always hold NSF especially in high esteem, as I always say to you, because I've applied for one NSF grant in my life and I received it, so I'm always very happy with NSF. And that was a dissertation improvement grant, and so I'm especially attuned to the importance of nurturing young investigators. But what I want to ask about here, going down to a lower level in terms of school level, I'm pleased to see the President's American Competitive Initiative proposes doubling the research budgets, but the education budget is getting much smaller increase. And we continue to see the latest NAEP results, problems that high school students are having, 40% scoring below basic math level, but we're not seeing the increases, or we're seeing decreases in the funding for education and at NSF. Now, how is NSF going to accomplish the goal of reversing these trends and educating more, bringing up the education level, science, math, STEM ed in general, with these underfundings in these crucial areas?
Well, let me say, Congressman, that education is clearly one of our highest priorities, if not the highest, and we work closely with the board on this issue. You ask about national needs and whether the Science Foundation is addressing national needs. I can't think of a more important national need at the present time than education. And here I'm talking about K to postdoc. Continuity all up the learning ladder. Our focus is pretty much in three areas. Clearly, one is to produce more STEM-educated teachers, and also to upgrade content proficiency of existing teachers. So teacher preparation and in-service training is critically important. The second major priority is to fill up the pipeline, to encourage students through better instruction, through more excitement in the classroom, through more activity-based learning, through better integration of informal education with formal education, so that science museums and other and members of the media and even communities can be engaged.
So I appreciate all that, but are you concerned that in the proposed budget that there is not enough funding for education, and that perhaps NSF is in some ways being squeezed out of the K through 12 education sector?
Well, I think that's turning around. We do have the opportunity in 2008 in our Math and Science Partnership to award $30 million worth of new grants, and I think that came about as a result of the evaluation of that program to show that it was very effective in increasing both math and science proficiency. So we hope that's on a different slope at the present time, a positive slope instead of a negative slope. Many other programs that we've targeted because of their effectiveness, some deal with undergraduate education. But our GK-12 program, which is a program that makes possible graduate students going into the classroom in K-12 classes to serve as a resource base in teaching math and science, working with the teachers, working with the students, and that's turned out to be one of our most effective programs, providing that role model in the classroom. And some of these programs were not plussed up in 2008 because they're still undergoing evaluation, and at the time the budget was being put together, we had the mandate from Congress that we establish the American Competitiveness Council, and the sense of Congress was the program shouldn't be substantially increased unless they had been shown to be effective through third-party or rigid evaluation. Some of the programs that were flat-funded are undergoing evaluation in 08. Some will be completed in 07. So that my full expectation is that we'll continue to push on those programs and try and plus them up in future budget cycles. But your point is well taken. We just have to continue pushing on the NSF role in education.
If the chairman will indulge me for another 30 seconds, I just want to say I'm looking forward to the National Science Board STEM Ed proposal that will be coming out, and I'm also interested. Maybe I will follow up later about what is going on in terms of NSF with nanotechnology and the National Nanotechnology Initiative. What NSF is doing, and also about the Interagency Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technical Task Force. What is going on with that? But I'll yield back right now.
Thank you, Dr. Lipinski. Mr. Hall, prepared to ask some questions at this point.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm sorry to be late. Most of us, all of us, I guess, have other committees that require a lot of our time, and I didn't know what questions had been asked, Mr. Chairman, until I could. But you're very capable of handling this, and I appreciate you and appreciate the things and your background. And Dr. Ehlers, of course, is one we go to, and he's really the champion of the National Science Board and folks that are taking the leadership there. I wanted to ask Dr. Bering and Dr. Bement, I guess either one of you, most of the K-12 education funding in the President's American Competitiveness Initiative is for programs at the Department of Education. And our committee has a few bills before it that speak to K-12 education at the NSF, particularly H.R. 524, which was a Partnerships for Access to the Laboratory Science bill, and H.R. 362, the 10,000 Teachers, 10 Million Minds Math and Science Scholarship Act. And I guess I'd ask you to comment on those bills, if you would, in post-hearing questions. But for now, I'll ask that later. But what other role should NSF have with regard to the competitiveness agenda and K-12 STEM education? Dr. Bering, you want to go first?
I'll defer
or you want to go second?
I'll defer to my colleague.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, for that question. It's a very important question. The funding provided to the National Science Foundation for Education amounts to 1/10 of 1% of the total funding that goes into education, K-12 education. So it's a very precious resource, and that resource needs to continue to be focused on research and development, because there's very little funding that is available for research and development in education to develop better methods, better instructional materials, better teacher training, and so forth. And that means that at the end of our process, as we get into advanced development, we'll be able to show that these programs are effective, have an impact, can be scaled, can be transferred, and are sustainable. Those are the principal objectives of many of our programs. It requires effective partnerships with the states, with the school boards, and with other entities in order to hand that off and carry it into implementation. And that's what we spend a lot of time in our programs doing, is establishing partnerships. The Math and Science Partnership Program is a clear example, in order to carry those new methods and best practices into implementation. And that will continue to be our approach. The one thing that would really drain our resources is if we, in any bill, we're asked to really take on the implementation role, because that's more than we could possibly handle with any foreseeable resource that we could be assigned. So I would urge the committee to pay attention to some focus on education, research, and development, and appropriate resources for research and development in these bills.
Care to add to that?
When we come forward with our STEM Commission recommendations, I wouldn't be surprised if you will hear that one of the most important changes that is necessary for America is a revision of our attitude and commitment at the family and community level. As I've traveled around the country and the world in this regard, I'm struck by the fact that we send our kids off to school and forget them there, and the families and the communities are perfectly happy with that arrangement. We're going to have to reevaluate that. That won't cost any money, but it'll certainly wrench the way we look at things.
That's two good answers. I like those. Doesn't cost any money, it does more. I have one other question I want to ask Dr. Bement. I don't think the committee plans to hold a separate hearing for the NSF FY08 budget. So if you'd oblige me just for a moment to ask a few questions related to that. The FY07 joint budget resolution is favorable to NSF's research and related activities. This may have been asked. If it has, however, most of your other programs remain at the FY06 level. What impact will this have on the agency? And have you asked that, Dr. Ayler?
Well, it's a very good question. Obviously, we're very grateful and very excited about the increase in the research and related account budget. That will allow us to go forward with a number of new initiatives. The two areas that are still problematic for us is the EHR budget, which you've indicated. If we look at the increase from 06 to 08, there's a fairly healthy increase in much of the EHR budget, but it would have been very gratifying if we could have gotten some attention in the continuing resolution for EHR. The other part that is strained at the moment is that we have all this wonderful money in our research account, but we didn't get any money in our agency operation and award management account. So already starting from a situation where we had an extreme overload on our program officers, we've only exacerbated that. That's both the good and the bad part of it.
I thank you, and I think Dr. Ayler has already inquired about the industry partnerships, the parts of the language you like and don't like, and the drafting recommendations. I yield back my time, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. We'll have another round if the witnesses are amenable for a few more minutes. Great, and as the custom, we'll continue to go back and forth between both sides. Just a very quick thing. I don't want to take too much time with it, but Dr. Bement commented earlier about that it's NSF's policy to allow but not require cost sharing. Dr. Beering, is the board consistent with that perspective, that the allowance of cost sharing is supported by the board?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, that's good to hear, because I think it's important. I fully believe industry, which is coming to us through Rising Above the Gathering Storm and a host of other studies, is pointing out that we need well-educated workforce and scientists. I think it's important that they play a participatory role in that process, and I want to make sure we make it possible for them to do so. And indeed, while I wouldn't require it, I would encourage. I think Dr. Bement's point is well taken, that not everyone can obtain such cooperation or co-funding, but to the extent that someone can help bring that to the table, I think there's a nice synergy possible, and it should be allowed. A question that emerges to me as I've talked to some of the discipline-based sciences in some of the universities is, can we use the NSF grant process for research to facilitate the educational enterprise, and the educational enterprise at two levels? One, educating more scientists per se, but also educating more science educators. And it seems to me there's potential for either competitiveness or complementarity between grants. And let me give the example. If we award a large research grant to an individual, does that possibly insulate them, depending on how we structure the grant, does it possibly insulate them from the activity of actually training new scientists or training science educators? Or are there ways we can structure grants to incentivize those who who directly involve themselves in the education of scientists? I talked to one scientist who said, "You want us to start making sure we educate enough scientists? Tie our grants to it." He knew where his bread was buttered, and I'd welcome your thoughts about that.
Well, I'm absolutely floored that question came up, because in our criterion 2 for our grants, other impacts, that clearly is an area of focus, and we not only encourage it, but we expect it. Not only that, but we also require accountability. So it's not just reporting on the good science that was done under scientific merit. It's also important that they report on how they fulfilled their promise in criterion 2 as far as education is concerned. The other thing that I would mention is that a good bit of our education and research in education is really carried out by our research directorates. It's not just in E and HR. In fact, there's a very close partnership of mutually leveraging education that can be supported by the research directors in bringing new content knowledge into not only undergraduate education but K-12 education. So we need to do a better job on our website to make sure the community really does understand that.
So if two identical grants were to arrive at the desk of the reviewers, with the sole difference between them that one places explicit and greater emphasis on utilizing a portion of the grant to educate new scientists and to coordinate with the science education activities of the College of Education, that would be looked on more favorably, conceivably. If all other things...
Well, there is the question of whether we would give preference in criterion 2 for education or for industry coupling and so forth. The one thing that we have to be very cautious is that we don't use other impacts as a trump against scientific merit, because the scientific merit has to be there and it has to be solid. Otherwise, we begin to tarnish our gold standard of merit review. But those things are all taken into account by our panels, and the chances are pretty high that they would be considered.
We've yet to address issues in any detail today of encouraging and supporting researchers of diverse backgrounds, and particularly ethnic diversity or economic opportunities, and also gender issues. I'd appreciate either of you commenting briefly on that in what remaining time I have left.
Broadening participation has been a high priority in the foundation since I've come. It's in our priority list. It's in our strategic plan. It's up front in all of our research directorates and research offices. They take that very seriously. In fact, if you look at the total investment across the foundation in broadening participation, about a quarter to a third of that is funded through the research directorates and research offices in a variety of ways. And of course, that only provides internal leverage to be able to do more than we're currently doing. So I'm pretty proud about the wide variety of programs that we have that are dedicated to broadening participation and the way we can integrate those to get more impact and more leverage.
Dr. Bering, do you care to comment on that?
I would certainly agree with that. I'm reminded of an experience I had while I was dean of the medical school at Indiana. The accrediting commission came by and said, why don't you appoint a woman plastic surgeon? And I looked around at the time, and there weren't any. We've certainly fixed that issue, and it was by way of first finding out there was a problem, and then paying attention to it in the way that Dr. Bement has described.
Thank you, Dr. Bering. Dr. Ehlers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, just a comment. Several years ago, several of us in the Republican majority were successful in getting a bill through the Congress to double the NSF funding in 5 years. That eventually led to the present doubling plan, doubling in 10 years. Many of the problems we discussed here would be solved by having some additional funding. So in my mind, 5 years is better than 10 years. So let me challenge the new majority to try to go back to the bill we passed and I encourage you to do whatever you can to meet that standard. The other comment, we talked a bit about the young scientists versus the older scientists. Let's take just a broader view of that. Years ago, I know that Europe was very concerned about the brain drain of scientists moving to the U.S. I'm starting to discern a brain drain the other way because of lack of adequate funding here and increasing funding in other countries. We have actually lost ground compared to other countries, several other countries who are rapidly increasing their research funding. I personally know a scientist who moved to Europe recently. He was tired of struggling with annual grant requests and thought it would be wonderful to have a lifetime appointment with a guarantee of research funding. That's our competition. And so I just wanted to mention there's that aspect of it. Another one, we make a great deal about peer review in the U.S., and I think it's excellent. But it's also very important to have peers. And I talked to a young scientist recently who was not at all happy because, and it was not just young scientists versus older scientists, but this person had a very good new approach, was being recognized in the field for that, applied for an NSF grant, and was appalled at some of the comments by some of the so-called peers who reviewed it, in which the comments indicated a basic misunderstanding of the science involved. Obviously, we're not familiar with it. And he was even more discouraged when he contacted the person in charge of that directorate and talked to him and found that he also did not understand. So I think a major chore is not just worrying about young scientists getting it, but recognizing that many times the young scientists have new ideas that if someone's not been active in the research field for a few years may have passed them by. So it's a multifaceted problem. It's not just young versus old.
Yes.
And I think you can make good argument for dramatically increasing the funding for young scientists. But also you have to have good peer review.
Even though there wasn't a question there, I do have some opinions on those remarks. First of all, in our peer review process, in as much as we're emphasizing frontier research, we do try to include younger scientists who are pretty well recognized because they know where the frontier is and they know what's important at the frontier and where the important research is being done. And that has that's been a very positive contribution in our panels and even our individual reviews. But we do have due process within the foundation, where people who have been declined, investigators that have been declined, can challenge the decline, and that goes through several steps of review all the way up to the deputy director. So there are ways in which someone who feels that they haven't had an adequate peer review can get the attention of the foundation.
I hope you also recognize that the reluctance of a new researcher about doing that and alienating the leadership of the NSF.
Yeah. I do indeed.
How often is that actually done, Doctor, that someone appeals especially successfully appeals
Well, it's not very frequent. As the deputy director indicates, she's only had one appeal that came up to her level as a final review step, appeal step, and it wasn't worthy of consideration, so it was denied.
Dr. McNerney.
Thank you. As we've sort of been talking this morning, education is one of the issues that challenges our country in terms of science and technology. And I think a lot of it is a cultural issue. many of the young people don't look at science as a profession, or engineering as a profession that appeals to them. Is there anything that can be done within the National Science Foundation to sort of change that perception or attack the cultural issue that we're facing in terms of attracting young people into this profession?
Absolutely there is, Congressman. The focus right now is introducing science earlier in elementary school, perhaps 3rd to 5th grade, and even engineering for that matter, because that's hands-on and that can excite children toward science and engineering and give them some early understanding about what these fields are all about. The other thing that we can effectively do is try and work at the interfaces between primary and secondary education, community colleges, and with institutions of higher learning, universities and colleges. And this is the continuity I was talking about, because oftentimes a child will have a wonderful experience in an elementary school. Will transition to a secondary school, it may be a trouble school, or may not have adequate teaching talent in STEM education, and then it suddenly dissipates. It's a turnoff. The same thing between high school and college. So there needs to be more effective attention given to reducing the barriers and coupling preparation with expectation and entrance requirements at universities, so we don't lose people from those pathways as they move through the system. And that's where a lot of our effort is focused.
Well, in my district, there's some economically disadvantaged areas, and I see a lot of young people that aren't engaged in the process. And what I would suggest is that we find a way to make the science more glamorous looking, or engineering more appealing, because that's what it's going to take. We're going to have to go across those barriers to get people involved, to make children understand not only the practicality but also the beauty of science. And so that's my recommendation.
You're absolutely right. And this is where the business community can come in, because we know that even in some troubled areas where the business community is not only committed but actually engaged, and where they can provide release time for their scientists and engineers to work with the public schools, that could make a difference. Also, again, coupling informal with formal education can be a way of exciting young minds to what science is all about. And that is a very effective program. In fact, as I go to public schools, I ask people, I ask the young children, do they know about the National Science Foundation? Only a few hands go up. But when I mention some of the television programs that we sponsor, almost all the hands go up, which makes me feel very good.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Our chairman noted the relatively large contributions to energy that conservation could make, like buying a more efficient car and carpooling, as compared to hard-won contributions of additional energy from alternative sources, which reminded me of a very interesting graph that on the ordinate has satisfaction with life, how good you feel about your life, and on the abscissa is per capita energy use. And if you can imagine that little graph in your mind's eye, we're way up at the upper right. This one person in 22 using a fourth of all the energy in the world. And there are 150-some countries, and they polled each of these countries how good they felt about their life, and they put a little spot on the graph. And not too surprisingly, way down on the left side of the graph, you have to have some meaningful amount of energy before you can feel good about your life. But that curve rises very steeply there. And after rising very steeply there, it then approaches something of an asymptote. It gets a little bit beyond where we are. But there are 27 countries in the world who use less energy than we, some of them less than half as much energy as we use, who feel better about their station in life than we feel. And I mention this because as big as the challenges are in the hard science areas, I think the biggest challenges for the future are going to be in the soft science areas. We're just going to have to get used to, as a world, and particularly in this country, living with less energy. And that's going to be a real challenge in the soft science area. Now, I come from the hard sciences in my personal training, but I recognize that in the future we're going to have really big challenges in the soft sciences. Is this a role that the National Science Foundation plays, or do we need to look for another entity for leadership here?
And no, Dr. Bartlett, it is a role that we're playing, and we pay a lot of attention to it. I might indicate that we do have energy initiatives in hydrogen and fuel cell technology, in advanced combustion, other means of conservation, including renewable fuels. Of course, these are proposals that are sent to us by top-ranked scientists who are really looking at the frontier of these fields and looking way ahead into the future. But your point of bringing in the human factors associated with energy production and energy use, and also satisfaction is a very important component. I think one of the reasons why we probably are energy hogs but not as well satisfied as we'd like to be is because of differences in productivity, but also the fact that we work ourselves to death compared with other nations where the lifestyles are considerably different. That is a very rich area for social science and understanding human factors.
I'm glad you mentioned hydrogen and fuel cells in the same breath, because as you know, and I suspect not everybody knows, the hydrogen is not an energy source. It is simply a convenient way to carry energy from one place to another. And of course, when you burn it, you get only water, which is not very polluting. But if we're really going to exploit the potential of hydrogen, it has to be with a fuel cell, doesn't it? Because in the fuel cell, it's a great candidate for a fuel cell. In a fuel cell, you get at least twice the efficiencies you get in a reciprocating engine. Just burning hydrogen in a reciprocating engine doesn't make much sense.
Well, you put your finger on it, and you're absolutely right. You have to look at net energy used, which means that you have to take into account the energy used in production of hydrogen. And if you're going to use energy, a fair amount of energy, especially thermal energy or electrical energy in electrolysis and producing hydrogen, you better darn well get it back with a higher efficiency engine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Bartlett, as always, insightful questions. I appreciate that, as often comes from members of this committee. One final question, and then we'll adjourn. I'm very interested in the role of technical education, and particularly sciences in the role of technical education. As I've talked to a number of our major employers back home, yes, they need top-flight sciences to do the high technology engineering and research, but they also need folks who can just work in a high technology environment, do such things as basic math, averages, scatter plots, the kind of things that unfortunately oftentimes our high school graduates can't do. Could you, either of you, talk briefly about the technical education aspects of NSF and what you see as the future of that?
I'm going to address it in a way that Dr. Beering can also address it, because coming from Purdue, I'm familiar with the outstanding technology program that they have. Oftentimes when we compare ourselves with China and India, we talk about the large number of engineers they produce and compare it with the engineers we produce, but oftentimes we don't include technicians and technician training in the equation. And yet, if you look at what those people do, our technicians are fulfilling jobs in the workplace very much like the engineers in other countries are fulfilling. So we ought to pay attention to that. Through our Advanced Technological Education program, our ATE program, we have developed partnerships with industry. About 90% of our ATE programs with community colleges work in cooperation with the private sector. And the reason why those partnerships are critically important is that the private sector has the jobs. They know what requirements, skill requirements, they're going to need not only today but in the future. So those industry leaders are the ideal people and their engineering staffs to help structure the curriculum for these community colleges. And in all of our evaluations, we're finding that that's one of the most effective programs we have in the NSF, not only in training top technical talent, but taking away the excuse in the private sector that we have to go abroad because we can't find the technical talent we need here in the United States. I'd like to see us get rid of that through more investment in our ATE program.
Dr. Beering, any comments?
Yeah, we're going to speak to that with our engineering and also STEM task forces very shortly. And I'd second what Dr. Bement has said. The concern about the Chinese engineers, for example, is that we haven't identified who these people really are. They're mostly technologists rather than engineers in the sense that we employ that term. So the differences are not as dramatic as they appear on the surface. Another problem we have, anticipating what you'll hear from our STEM group, is that we do not welcome working professionals into the educational system. There are licensure problems and cultural blocks, and we need to do that. There are lots of retirees, for example, who would be delighted to come into the educational curriculum work, and I hope that we can get that done.
I note, for example, I appreciate that, Dr. Beering, neither Dr. Ehlers nor I would be certified to be able to teach in our respective disciplines at the high school level, and interestingly enough, on the vocational front, I know that some top-flight welders, folks who've worked their whole life in welding and know it inside and out, couldn't get a teaching certificate. I think we ought to look at that. I thank our witnesses. Are there other comments or questions from the panel? If not, then before we bring the hearing to close, I want to thank our witnesses for their outstanding work and for testifying before our subcommittee. This has indeed been a highly educational experience for us, and our witnesses have given us a lot to consider as we proceed with developing and marking up legislation to authorize programs at the National Science Foundation. If there's no objection, the record will remain open for additional statements from the members and for answers to any follow-up questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. Without objection, so ordered. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Well done.
Thank you.